Hi, I am here on economics and quarantine, and we are here with Jay Cameron. Jay is a lawyer. He is litigation manager at the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, a Calgary-based legal advocacy group which defends Canadians' constitutional freedoms. And am I right? You recently were involved in the case with Jessica Yaniv. Am I mistaken?
No, that's correct.
Mr. Cameron has, as a lawyer, appeared for cases at every level of court in 5 provinces and at the Supreme Court of Canada. Today, we are going to be discussing the novel coronavirus and the government's ability to legally act in the face of it. Before that, I'd like to talk with you about some figures. And these figures, I never know how to interpret them because I never know exactly what kind of testing is being done in each of the provinces. But according to official statistics, we have 24,383 cases of coronavirus in Canada, 717 deaths of Canadians and those who live in the Canadian provinces, and 7,172 people have recovered from COVID-19. Now, first of all, you work at the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, and this is a center which is primarily involved in pushing the idea that constitutional rights are important. And I agree with that. I agree that the Constitution is important. I respect the Constitution as a foundational document of this country. But that being said, I find that a lot of people are a little bit complacent when it comes to the Constitution. When I'm teaching my first year economics class, I briefly discuss the Canadian Constitution since it spells out legal constraints on the ability of federal and provincial governments and municipal governments to implement economic policy. Based on my admittedly limited experience, I find that the Constitution is not well taught in public schools. I think you'll agree with that. You work at an organization which defends the Canadian Constitution. Could you provide a brief summary as to why Canadians should care about this document?
Sure. So the Constitution, just like other countries' constitutions, provides a framework with checks and balances for the use of government power. It provides parameters, if you will. And it also sets out what the rights of citizens and residents are. And so the Constitution, a constitutional document, really is the difference between living under arbitrary dictatorship rule or an ordered system with limits on government power and set rights for citizens that are recognized in the rule of law. And it has been, the Canadian Constitution has been codified, and there is a clear law generally with which provides people with the ability to know what their rights and their obligations are, and it also provides government with the requirement that they comply with the limitations on their power, and it sets out those rights in a prominent fashion, the rights and obligations in a prominent fashion, so the citizens can look at them and know what's going on in the nation, and then it provides courts of justice which are for recourse with respect to those rights. And it is a truism that it's a mark of tyranny to make up laws as you go, to change them at your whim. And the Constitution protects against that from occurring. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada is part of the Constitution. It sets up the fundamental rights recognized for Canadians, and it says that rights which are recognized in the Charter can't be infringed absent demonstrable necessity and in a consistent manner with a free and democratic society. And that test is supposed to be an onerous one on government.
So, for example, the government can't just come to my house and start raiding through my closet and, picking up my iPhone and picking up my cell phone and, looking through my cell phone, looking through my recordings. They can't just do that at whim, according
That's
to
right.
Yeah.
That's right. You have a right. You have a right to be free of unreasonable searches and seizures. You have an expectation of privacy. You have a right to due process. You have a right to habeas corpus. You have a right to freedom of speech and freedom of conscience and religion, and freedom of association and assembly and the press and freedom of opinion. And all of those rights are set out, rights to life and liberty and security of the person. And they're all codified in the Charter. And so the charter is meant to be a shield over the citizens and protecting them from government intrusion. This is very important.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Now, is that something that the Constitution spells out? In what I'm asking, really, is it only the Constitution that prevents the government from acting in an arbitrary manner, or is it the norms that go along with government, that go along with the bureaucracy, maybe, or go along with the justice system, that go along with the police, that prevent us from overstepping these boundaries?
That's a good question. So, some of the rights in the Charter, and perhaps most of the rights in the Charter, were codified in law, in the common law, long before the existence of the Charter. Charter didn't come around until 1982, but the rights in the Charter are not the culmination of Canadian history only. They come out of the abuse of centuries from tyrant kings and corrupt and oppressive churches, sometimes together, church and state. And it is out of that history of oppression regarding speech and religion and deprivation of property and removal of professional licenses and arbitrary detention and incarceration without limits and without any standards with respect to what, you could be thrown into the tower and left to molder there for the rest of your life. And there was no, there were no parameters around state control and the exercise of state power. And so it is out of that kind of history that the codification and the recognition of human rights comes. And so, for example, there was a guy by the name of William Tyndale, mm-hmm. and he was burnt at the stake. And you would think, well, that's a very severe punishment. What did he do, right? Did he assassinate somebody? Did he, was he sowing insurrection? Was he, did he engage in treason? No, William Tyndale's crime was he translated the Bible into the English language. And so there was a show trial, he was strangled, and then he was burnt. And that was the civil authorities and the church authorities that sort of colluded together to do that. And it's sort of out of that kind of stuff that was going on, just a few centuries before now, that you have this, you had an uprising of citizens against governments saying, we have rights because we are humans. Humans don't come from government. Government don't make people. People come from God. And we have certain natural rights as human beings. And it's not your purview to say, you're going to take them away at your whim. And so it's out of that type of thing that you have the development of the common law and the recognition of certain rights. And so your question is a really good one, because in the English common law, you have, even before the Constitution, you had a recognition that governments had limits on their power. But the codification of those limits is very important because it provides added certainty and added protection for citizens.
Yeah, they're both sort of necessary from each other's point of view. I mean, I think the norms and the history are important because I can think of countries, I can think of regions which have de jure constitutional rights, but don't de facto actually practice those rights. And on the other hand, you need the codification of those rights, I think, for clarity's sake, right? Now, I'd like to turn to Bill 10 in Alberta. Speaking of clarity and speaking of constitutional rights, this is a bill, I think, that troubles you. Could you, just for my listeners' sake, tell us briefly what Bill 10 is and what worries you about Bill 10 from a constitutional point of view?
Sure. So in Alberta, just like in lots of other provinces, there's something called the Public Health Act. If it's not called that in other provinces, the purpose is the same thing. It's the state's legislative power to help protect the public health. And so in the previous version, which has now been amended by Bill 10, there was very sweeping powers for the health minister to do a lot of different things in the event of a public health emergency. For example, he could suspend part or all of an enactment that he was overseeing, or he could conscript citizens to assist in various things. He could come into property without a warrant. He could take property away. There are enormous powers in the Public Health Act, and those powers are they have not been subject to constitutional scrutiny. They were passed by the Legislative Assembly of Alberta, and they were very broad, and in some cases very concerningly broad, and probably need to go to court to have the court assess their constitutionality. But Bill 10, which was passed on April 2nd, it was introduced for first reading on March 31st, passed April 2nd, so 48 hours. And it is an amendment to the Public Health Act. And what it does is it gives even more power to the health minister in the event of a public health emergency. And so whereas before the health minister could say, all right, I'm going to suspend this part of an enactment, or I'm going to do this or this, now the health minister can actually make new laws. He can add to the laws. He can add offenses. He can add basically whatever he wants if he thinks it's in the public interest. And so we say that's unconstitutional, and on its face it is, for several reasons. First of all, and perhaps the primary reason, is that the Constitution divides democratic powers to the federal government and the provincial governments with respect to overseeing society. What that means is that the federal government has certain jurisdiction, the provincial government has certain jurisdiction, but those powers are apportioned to the provinces as to the democratically elected legislature. They're not apportioned to an individual. And so in Canada, we have a democracy. And, so that means citizens elect representatives who run the government, and they do so on behalf of citizens. And there's this democratic process whereby people are accountable through elections. And then people are also, there's also an added check of balance that there's voting, there's debate, there's study, right, prior to the enactment of laws. And, the legislatures go through this exercise on behalf of the people. That's the whole point of the system of government we have. And what Bill 10 does is it does away with that in the event of a public health emergency. It says the legislature isn't going to make laws with respect to this. This individual is going to make laws, the health minister.
I see.
And he's going to do whatever he wants.
But can the health minister contravene constitutional rights in that case? Like, for example, if the health minister deems it necessary to, for example, quarantine me forcibly, or to, decide to, for example, take away my rights, can he do that at a whim because of the Public Health Act and because of this amendment to it?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, theoretically speaking, what the minister does is subject to the Constitution, but good luck trying to get the actions of the minister overthrown on the basis that they violate a charter right when the courts are closed. So the courts are shut throughout Alberta, essentially, except for really what's being conducted on just this sort of minimal basis is bail hearings for people who are detained, and the rest of what's occurring in the province of Alberta is suspended. And so if you have a violation of your rights and the courts are closed, how are you supposed to get recourse? Mm-hmm. And so the suspension of democracy and vesting of legislative power in an individual is on its face an unconstitutional power grab. And like I said, there's no limit as to what the health minister can do. So you've raised the issue of quarantine. Well, I can see scenarios like you where some quarantine is justifiable. But there are limits to when quarantine would be justifiable, and there's a bunch of other things that could be done by the health minister, like, for example, contact tracing, using cell phone apps, or mandatory testing, or mandatory vaccination, or restrictions on who can drive, or those types of things. And so, in a democracy, you would want, and the Constitution requires, that decisions like that are made by elected representatives of the people, not by one individual. Because if you have the vesting of power in one individual, you don't have a democracy anymore, you have a dictatorship.
Sure, I agree with that in principle, but I'm going to ask you a question in a minute, but first I'm going to lay out my views. And that question that I'm going to ask you is really about the balancing of the priorities we have regarding people's health and well-being versus the constitutional rights that we all have as Canadians. First, I'm going to just lay out my views. Okay, I agree with NEXI, the New England Complex Systems Institute, that we can beat the coronavirus with a 3-week mandatory lockdown, mandatory testing, forced quarantine of all of those who test positive. And I'm actually perfectly okay for that reason. For the reason that I think that COVID-19 is a serious health crisis and we should all do our part to reduce its spread. For that reason, I'm perfectly fine with a temporary suspension of a few of my charter rights, such as freedom of movement and association, in order to contain the coronavirus. I would even be fine with the government invoking the Emergencies Act for a short period of time. That being said, I think like you, I am skeptical. I am skeptical of government, and I find many Canadians to be overly complacent. Maybe you don't because of the kind of people you interact with. But the government here with the coronavirus grossly mismanaged the response. And Theresa Tam, I think you'll agree, has been particularly incompetent. Indeed, if we had taken care of this back in January, then we wouldn't need to suspend rights today. If the government uses this crisis to permanently institute dangerous programs, such as broader and more intrusive surveillance, then that would be a tragedy. And I know that the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms has taken a strong position on COVID-19. You can check it out on their website, and you've warned that the government's duty to act should be balanced against legal checks and balances. So I have two related questions. First question, COVID-19 puts the country's health at risk. Even if you think that deaths are low, I mean, 1 in 5 people who have this condition seem to need hospitalization. And even if the argument is that we don't know much about the novel coronavirus, then you could say better safe than sorry. Does it make sense to haggle over a long period of time over legal technicalities? You know, maybe you could say constitutional rights is one of those. Does it make sense to haggle over legal technicalities and legal ramifications when people are dying? Or does it just, you know, or is that not a concern that we should have?
Well, there's a number of things that I would respond with. I mean, first of all, there's no doubt that the coronavirus is dangerous to some people. It has killed a lot of people in the world, but there are other people who get it and they have no symptoms at all and they recover quickly, or they recover quickly, and so you have to engage in some sort of a cost-benefit analysis here when you are going to shut down the entire society and destroy the economy. For example, our government's taking into account how many suicides are projected to take place. What about the rise in alcoholism and other addictions as a result of the lockdown? How many spouses are going to be abused or killed? How many children will be put in foster care because of domestic abuse or loss of their abilities, their parents' abilities to provide for them? What about the people who are projected to become sick or die because the government forced them into unemployment and poverty, and forced their families into bankruptcy?
No, I would just push you on that a little bit, and I would say that's a bit of a hypothetical at this stage, right?
There are statistics. This has been going on for a long time.
Right.
So there is governments gather statistics. Those statistics haven't been released to the public.
Mm-hmm.
There's the loss of charities, the loss of the ability of people to have surgeries when they need to, lack of access to secondary health providers, the rise of psychiatric illnesses. Are these things being considered by government? And the answer is we don't know, and you have a right to know. But the other thing
Sure.
is that Cornelius, is that
I agree with that.
Anecdotally, you hear about hospitals which were projected to be overrun with people, and they're not. They're not. They're largely idle in a lot of places across the country, and there was supposed to be this big influx of people. People are all quarantined inside their houses, and if they step out, they're getting these draconian fines levied on them because they go for a walk in the forest or a park. And so I mean, in Canada, you have a right to ask questions, and the Emergencies Act is subject to the Charter.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, I mean, you said maybe I'm in contact with a lot of people who, are very vigilant with respect to their rights. But the fact of it is that Canadians are some of the most cavalier people with their rights, and are perhaps the least vigilant people on the face of the earth at the moment. We're particularly noteworthy for being sheep-like when it comes to doing what is told of us, and going along with what Big Brother says. And it is a terrible mistake to be complacent about moves by government to restrict civil liberties and not ask questions.
Yeah, it is a stark contrast, I find, when I go down south to the border, just even to upstate New York, you find a distinct difference in views about the role of government and skepticism towards government institutions in the United States versus Canada. Now, going off on what you said about the Emergencies Act, you said the Emergencies Act is subject to the Constitution. So my second question is this: what principle do we use to weigh people's rights in an emergency like COVID-19? If the government were, for example, to invoke the Emergencies Act, what test, legal or otherwise, would be sufficient in order for them to do so?
Well, Section 1 of the Charter says that the rights are guaranteed insofar as is justifiable in a free and democratic society, right? And that they can't be infringed outside of what is reasonable and demonstrably justifiable in a free and democratic society. And so those are, I mean, there's a number of principles there: freedom, democratic society, right? It's justifiable, and it has to be reasonable, or it has to be necessary, right? The infringement, courts have said that the infringement of charter rights has to take place on a standard on a high standard, that the governments have to show what we are doing is both it's rationally connected, it's an objective that is justifiable. We're taking these steps for an objective that is justifiable, and the steps that we're taking are rationally connected, and they're minimally impairing. And so there's a bunch of hoops that the government, if the courts were open, would have to go through. For example, you could say, let's take the example of Ebola, right? Where Ebola kills 50% of the people who get it, and at least, right? And it's this horrible plague that is exceedingly contagious. And would the government be justified in shutting down society and quarantining people in order to stop Ebola? I think that there's a really good argument to be made there that there are some fairly significant steps that the government take to try and save society from Ebola. But is the government justified in quarantining people and making it so they can't leave their house for 3 weeks, even to go for a walk in the forest, because they're having a fight with their spouse, or because their spouse is drinking alcohol and has become abusive, and they need to get out of the house, and they're not talking to anybody, and they're not in any proximity to people, and then you give that person $1,000 fine? Is that justifiable? Right. And so you get into this analysis with respect to what's taking place, and you have to have that analysis. You have to have that dialogue. Otherwise, government does whatever it wants, and then it doesn't want to rescind the powers that it has given itself.
Very briefly, these words, justifiable and rational, they seem a little bit vague, right? It seems like it's very much context dependent what that would mean. And it seems like it would be even open to interpretation, right? What does rational mean? What does justifiable mean?
Yeah, I mean, rational means like does the steps that the government is taking, do they make sense given what the objective is, right? Are they connected to the objective? So, in Michigan, the governor, who is has revealed herself to be tremendously authoritarian, has said, you can't buy certain things now because they're non-essential. And she's made this arbitrary list about what is essential and what is non-essential. And so she said, you can't buy garden seeds, because those are non-essential. And you can't
Really?
buy paint. Yes, you
Wow.
can't buy paint for your house because that's non-essential. And so they've got,
As a gardener, I would really hate that.
sure, and you've got people who
Yeah.
are worried about supply chains and things like that, and yet you're preventing people from buying seeds. I mean, so
Yeah.
is that rational? No, it's
Yeah.
not rational. It's nonsensical, it's arbitrary, but it's worse than that. It's tyrannical, it's abusive, and it's offensive to the free society. And
Yeah.
so I mean, there's shades there, but then there's some things that are clearly black and white, in my respectful opinion.
Sure. A lot of this response is dependent on models, and I'm an economist and I use models, but I don't necessarily believe the models that I use, if that makes any sense. There was once, I think, a guy by the name of Box, who was a statistician, who said that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I very much agree with that sentiment. Now, your colleague, John Carpe, penned a Post Millennial piece on April 5th, which I'll link in the description box below. In it, he argued that federal and provincial governments should release the mathematical models they are using to guide coronavirus policy. I couldn't agree more. I absolutely agree. I wish they would. I wish they would not only release the model, but release the data that they're using and release the code that they're using as well, so that people like me who are interested can run those models. However, the government argues that releasing any data or releasing any models that have to do with the data would cause panic. How would you respond to that? And has the government taken any steps towards more transparency since that article was published?
Yeah, I mean, that's ridiculous paternalism for the government to say we're going to restrict your liberties, but essentially we're not going to tell you why we're doing it.
Yeah.
That's oppressive. Why does the government, I mean, and the government, like, people think the government is some entity that is all knowing. The government is not all knowing. It is just made up of people who are exactly the same as you and I. They put their pants on one leg at a time and they go to work, and they're vested with a certain amount of power for a certain period of time, and they're supposed to exercise it in a responsible fashion. So, I mean, you have massive unemployment as a result of what has occurred. Well, the government had better be able to justify it with models and projections and statistics. Otherwise, what they're doing is not only oppressive, but it's tyrannical. And it is an act of tyrannism to say that we are going to curtail your civil liberties for an unlimited period of time, and we're not going to tell you on what basis we're justifying it.
Yeah, and based on what you're telling me, and I'm not a lawyer, but based on what you're telling me, it seems like by holding that information and not allowing the public to sift through it, you're essentially contravening the spirit of Section 1 of the Constitution. Am I wrong?
No, you're absolutely right.
Yeah. Now, shifting now to specific issues with COVID-19 response, the Canadian law guarantees the right to manifest religious belief by worship and practice or by teaching and dissemination. Essentially, you can go to a church and you can worship God there. You can go to a synagogue or a Hindu temple or whatever, right? A mosque, it doesn't really matter. However, as a result of the coronavirus, most churches, including my own, synagogues, temples, and mosques, have effectively shut their doors. And the government has not deemed them to be essential services, even though people turn to religion during times like these. On the other hand, a number of super spreader events have occurred due to religious services. For example, an Islamic congregation called Tablighi Jamaat, and I'm probably butchering that name, but it's an Islamic congregation in Delhi in India, and a Christian prayer meeting in Northwest Calgary, which you're probably familiar with, have led to a burst in coronavirus COVID-19 cases. Given that the government has decided to shut down much of the economy, should its definition of essential expand to include religious services?
Yeah, complicated question, but an important question, just like all the questions that you're asking. I personally, and this is just my personal opinion, I don't have a problem with the government saying, look, we don't understand this, but it's killing a bunch of people. We want to limit non-essential gatherings to a certain number of people for a period of time to see whether or not that helps flatten the curve they set a time limit on it. I think that's one of the main things that's missing from the Canadian response is that there's no time limit, right? It's indefinite.
That's true.
So say 2 weeks, right? 2 weeks, we're going to shut things down, and no social gatherings over 10 people. A lot of these churches are populated with elderly people. They appear to be uniquely vulnerable to the coronavirus. We're asking everybody to limit public gatherings for a short period of time. So, but hypothetically speaking, going back to your example, I don't have a problem constitutionally for a short period of time limiting public gatherings and taking precautions, the government doing that. That's hypothetically speaking, that's justifiable.
All right. So we're getting towards the end now. I would like to shift a little bit away from COVID-19 at this point. I think we can go on and on and on about this. And I don't necessarily agree with everything you're saying. But that being said, aside from COVID-19, what would you say is the biggest constitutional threat facing Canadians now, or constitutional threats facing Canadians now?
Governments are elected to uphold constitutional rights.
Mm-hmm.
And there is not a single government in Canada that I could definitively point to and say, this government sees it as a paramount mandate, part of its mandate, to protect and uphold civil liberties. Governments get into power, whether from the left or the right, and they act in furtherance of a particular ideological agenda. That is what has been the norm in Canadian politics for quite a while. Instead of saying to themselves, as a fundamental and first and foremost priority, how can we ensure that fundamental rights are not only protected, but how can we ensure that they thrive in our governance model? Nobody does that these days. And consequently, you have governments that work very hard in some cases to bypass fundamental rights in Canadian society. And that is broadly, I think that's the largest problem.
So it wouldn't be something specific. You can't put it down to something specific, like, let's say, free speech. It's more of an institutional, I guess, tumult that's driving this, right? That's saying, basically, we can do whatever we want. We can overstep people's charter rights. We can overstep people's constitutional rights. There's sort of that feeling among government, this feeling of hubris that's driving their actions, I suppose.
Yeah, the implication of the general statement is manifest in some of the things, though, that you're seeing at the federal government level, like with respect to hate speech, for example. Mm-hmm. I testified at a parliamentary subcommittee with respect to hate speech, and the subcommittee had set out what it was studying, and they'd made no mention of Section 2B charter rights. And so they're trying to figure out how they can stop hate speech without considering the Constitution, without considering a number of problems with respect to the existing law with respect to hate speech prohibitions in the criminal code. They're proposing sanctioning social media companies and fining them if hate speech isn't taken down within 24 hours, for example. Well, what is hate speech? Who decides what it is? Mm-hmm. Some bureaucrat with a laptop sending off a threatening email to Facebook saying, take that down within 24 hours or I'll fine you $100,000. I mean, is that the model that's being proposed? And the answer to that is essentially yes. That's what we're proposing.
I know I said I would take this away from COVID-19, but under the present laws that are being put in place in Canada by both the federal government and the provinces, just going off this issue of speech, can the government shut down, for example, a newspaper article or a newspaper column that's overly critical, let's say, of a government model or a government statistic, or even of, let's say, Theresa Tam, or even of, let's say, the premier of Newfoundland, the premier of, just picking by random year, but the premier of Alberta, the premier of Ontario, the Prime Minister of Canada? Can the government, under the current set of laws and under the current precedents that they've set by enacting these lockdown procedures, can they impose their will upon freedom of speech?
The short answer to that is no, they can't. However, what they're doing, what they're fumbling around for at the moment, and I think they were probably interrupted by the COVID virus, is they want to make internet service providers, social media companies, their proxies through threat. And so, there's free speech vis-a-vis the government, but if you post something on Facebook that the government doesn't like, or on Twitter that the government doesn't like, that's going to be deemed hate speech, and the social media companies are taking it down. And that's happening. It's well known that it's happening. It's happening on Twitter. If you say certain things on Twitter, you get censored, even though the fact that what you're saying is entirely legal. There's nothing illegal about what you're saying, but Twitter takes it down, right? And so people throw around the label of hate speech. That's hate speech. Well, no, it's not. It's speech that they disagree with, and they don't like, and they don't want to respond to, and they want to prevent, and so they label it that. And it becomes a means to stifle discussion and stifle the exercise of democratic civil rights.
Yeah, I mean, this issue of speech is something that's very close to my heart. It's something that I care a lot about. And that's why it's a real pleasure to have you on. I don't think we agree on certain issues regarding COVID-19, like the response, but it was a pleasure to have you on, Jay. Where can we find you? Do you have a Twitter? Do you have a blog? And I'll link all of that below in the description box.
Yeah, sure. I'm on Twitter. The handle is Juris Cameron. And I'm not on Facebook, but occasionally I write columns for National Post or other newspapers, but primarily I keep a low social media profile, and I let my legal work do the talking.
That's good policy. So I will link the Twitter below. I will also link your colleague John Carpe's Post Millennial article below. And I would just like to thank you very much for being on my show. And I hope you take care in Alberta. Stay safe.
Cornelius, thank you very much. Health and blessings to your family, and stay free.